Thanks for coming. This Friday on Founders Day, March 8th, Utah State University celebrates its 125th year anniversary. In commemoration of this historic event, the library has assembled the materials exhibited in the foyer. If you've not done so, I encourage you to go out and take a look at them. We've tried to illustrate the university's history through the lives of a few notable graduates. There have been many. I'd like to recognize those most responsible for the exhibit, my colleagues in special collections, particularly Dan Davis, the acknowledged photo wizard of the archival world. Kristen Heel, graphics designer extraordinaire, and Rose Milovich, who has worked to reinvigorate our exhibits program during the last few years. Lastly, Dean Rick Clement, there he is, who, when he first arrived here, recognized immediately the value of the exhibit program and has encouraged participation from us all. Rick, I have learned, does not like walking into the library and seeing blank white walls. Oh no. I knew it would do this. Which one, Trina? Oh, there we go. Green. There we go. Just to ease in my discussion tonight, I'd like to say a word or two about haircuts. I won't apologize, as a former colleague of mine once did when he showed up to Faculty Senate with a crew cut. This does not so much represent a haircut, he declared, as it does a failure to communicate. I hope I may be more successful tonight in communicating a few things regarding the university's history. And because this is an event sponsored and supported by the Friends of the Merrill Kazir Library, a thing or two about the library's historical development and that of the library's special collections and the university's archives. But first, permit me to ramble a bit longer on about haircuts. I get haircuts usually only when I'm told I need one. It's perhaps a lingering aversion from a misspent youth playing rock and roll electric guitar. Or it may be just a matter of self-preservation. What rational person would want to cut something off when they have so little of it left? The last time I ventured over to the Student Center for a little trim, the young beautician asked me if I worked on campus. I told her yes, in the library. What do you do there, she asked. I'm in archives, I answered. Oh. What's an archive? I have learned over the years that the answer to this question is not easy. So sometimes I tell people that I try not to publicize what I do in the archives very much, because if people found out what I did and how great a job it was, everybody'd want to do it. So eventually I'll try to explain as lucidly as I possibly can that the purpose of university archives is to preserve and document the historical development of the institution. It's a repository of institutional memory, I'll say. Now, it's not brain surgery, nor is it rocket science. Some of us may actually know how to perform a brain surgery or a rocket, or launch a rocket into space. This is a university, after all. But all of us have read enough books and seen enough movies that we generally understand how the process works. But documenting the historical development of the institution, a repository of institutional memory, what's that? Oh, the young woman said, how long have you been doing that? Well, let's see, I pondered. When I first started, some still referred to this as the Union Building. And Dick Swenson ran the barber shop. Stan Kazir was not quite midway through his presidency. And if you were cutting my hair back when I first started, there would be a whole lot less gray accumulating on the floor. Now, Rick, Brad, before you send me over to HR for sensitivity training. Let me assure you that my conversation in the barbershop was all in good humor. There are two things I've learned during the course of my life that have nothing much to do with archives, but can apply to a variety of other relations. One, don't aggravate your drummer, because he can make you sound really bad. Two, don't irritate your barber, because he or she can make you look really bad. And for those of us who enjoy reading or watching a good Western on occasion, this of course becomes even more critical if he or she happens to be holding a straight razor. So beyond these two important life lessons, what have I learned while working in the archives? I have learned that names change, but outcomes are essentially the same. There's not much difference between a long-range plan, a strategic plan, and a compact plan. Names have changed from divisions to departments, from schools to colleges, from a college to a university. But ultimately, the purpose and the mission of the institution has remained simple and constant. We educate students. USU's name has changed. Am I keeping up with this? Yeah, I believe I'm okay. USU's name has changed a number of times, beginning in 1988. As the UAC, or the old AC. Notice the color. Changed in 1929 to the Utah State Agricultural College, and finally to Utah State University. Sorry, John, I'm going to put a hat on. There we go. Pictured here is George Dewey Clyde, governor of Utah, who signed the proclamation which changed us from a college to a university on Founders Day, 1957. I have learned that politics is always impinged on the institution. Hoping to sustain the University of Utah in Salt Lake City as the state's preeminent institution of higher learning in 1907, the state legislature restructured the curriculum at the old AC, prohibiting courses in engineering and teacher education. With some modification, these restrictions would stand for 2 decades. Politics largely determined the appointment and dismissal of the first 5 presidents. As gubernatorial appointees, board members hired and fired presidents according to their political persuasion. I've learned that when the last of these 5, John A. Whitstow, a Republican, replaced Democrat William J. Kerr in 1907, half the faculty resigned in protest. I've also learned, however, that no one is irreplaceable, for as Whitstow asserted when the group of professors packed up their offices to leave campus, the institution would survive. And it did, and in many ways, it emerged with an even stronger faculty than before. The institution, I've learned, is more than any one individual. It's a sum total of all of us. I have learned that politics also played a role in the dismissal of President E.G. Peterson, who after 30 years as president drew the fire of certain board members during World War II when he separated range management from out of the School of Agriculture and created a new School of Forestry, Range, and Wildlife Management, the predecessor to our College of Natural Resources. Moreover, when the board fired Lewis Madsen, a decade later, at least a third of the student body walked out of class, formed a motorcade, drove to Salt Lake City, where they invaded the state capitol in protest. I have learned that students and faculty come together in times of crisis, whether it was following the tragic deaths of 8 students and their instructor in a van rollover on September 29, 2005, or the death of Bernie Dougal, a member of the old AC's first graduating class of 1894 who died in the fiery Schofield mine disaster in Emery County. Once you are an Aggie, your family. I have learned that students took the initiative to maintain these familiar ties when they founded the Alumni Association in 1899. In 1907, students created a student government, the predecessor organization to the Associated Students of USU. They campaigned and held elections for student body officers. That tradition continues, as evidenced by the billboards that lined the campus sidewalks just last week. In 1910, past and present students published the first yearbook called the AC Graduate, and the next year issued the first buzzer, an annual publication that persisted until 1971. I know that Vendla Bernstein was the first student to register at the old AC, paying her $5 entry fee in September 1890, and that she was only 14 years old. She entered the preparatory department both because of her tender age and because she, as was the case with many prospective students at the time, did not yet possess the academic skills to pass the college entrance exam. 3 years later, Vendla passed her exams and was admitted into the domestic science program. And I've learned that Vendla's first love was music, and that someday she had hoped to study at a prestigious Eastern Conservatory. A year after her matriculation, however, financial constraints forced her to suspend her education. That was not an unusual circumstance, either then or now. I took my first class at Utah State University in 1969. I returned a decade later and graduated in 1981. In 1900, Vendla married local musician Wilhelm Vogelberg. Wilhelm taught in the college's short-lived School of Music beginning in 1903. The music school, incidentally, was a victim of the same curricular restriction that affected engineering and pedagogy in 1907. Nevertheless, the couple became well known in Cache Valley music circles until Vendla's untimely death in 1924. As Utah's land-grant institution, the college's primary mission was to provide higher education for the, quote, industrial classes. I have learned, however, that the college's first president, Jeremiah W. Sanborn, who came to Utah from Vermont by way of Missouri, envisioned the college as much more than simply a training ground for farmers, mechanics, and homemakers. He saw the land-grant model as a means of introducing the nation's, quote, sons and daughters of toil to the arts, to great literature, and to music. To the college's first faculty, the Board of Trustees appointed Sarah Godwin Goodwin as music instructor. The stern Mrs. Goodwin wore other hats as well, so I've learned. She was the institution's first librarian and is shown in here tending the stacks in 1903 in the north wing of Old Main. I have learned that the light-colored large books visible on the bottom shelf behind Mrs. Goodwin are volumes of Charles Sprague Sargent's Silva of North America, which now occupy a shelf in our special collections. Furthermore, I hold here the first book purchased by the college and accessioned into the library in 1890, Philosophy, Historical and Critical by André Lefebvre. You can't hardly keep this baby on the shelf, I'll tell you what. Where is Cheryl here tonight? We should get this digitized and get this up in the IR. This provides continuity and a nice correlation between the past and the present. I know that for more than 50 years, Sargent's volumes of Silva of North America adorned the shelves of the library's Hatch Room. The Hatch Room was a gift of Boyd and Ann McQuarrie Hatch, and the library's rare books had been moved there following a decision to create the Hatch Memorial Reading Room in 1954. Having as its corpus the books, manuscripts, and furnishings donated by the Hatches, a committee comprised of librarians King Hendricks and Milt Abrams, art professor H. Reuben Reynolds, and history professor George Ellsworth, suggested that the room include other books and materials having irreplaceability or uniqueness. This marks the beginning of the Merrill Kazare Library's special collections. But foremost on Ellsworth's agenda was to collect those materials that he venerably referred to as Utahnalia. Ellsworth occasionally proclaimed that as a professor, he felt privileged to have taught the history of all three of the world's great cultures: Rome, Greece, and Utah. George delivered this statement with such perfect deadpan that those uninitiated to his subtle humor never quite knew when or if to laugh. And given his strong affection for Utah and Mormon history, George may not have intended his comparison to be entirely absurd. The committee hoped that a collection of letters, diaries, journals, or books of interest to this area would enhance the writing of a history of a valley. The history of Cache Valley, published to commemorate its centennial in 1956. I have learned that in order to further the Centennial History Project, Ellsworth had also spearheaded a drive to microfilm public and personal historical records from Cache Valley. Armed with a camera borrowed from the State Historical Society and film purchased by the library, Ellsworth supervised the filling of 29 rolls of film with images from Cache Valley's past. Included were diaries, scrapbooks, journals, business records, as well as the official government records of Cache Valley, of Cache County, Utah, and Franklin County, Idaho. These resources, I've come to find out, were to be housed in the Hatch Room, along with the library's other rare books and manuscripts, and designated as the official archive of the Cache Valley Historical Society. I have also learned that George Ellsworth was the institution's first archivist. This was an ancillary position and was in addition, it was largely self-imposed, and in addition to his considerable teaching load. I've learned that Ellsworth not only developed and taught the first course on Utah history at this institution, but also taught survey courses in ancient world civilizations, modern world civilizations, current world affairs, and modern U.S. history. As I already mentioned, he taught the courses on the history of Greece and Rome. But his classroom duties also extended to courses on medieval Europe, on the Renaissance and the Reformation period. Additionally, he developed and taught the first course on Hispanic American history. And once each year, just for good measure, he taught the senior seminar plus 2 graduate seminars, one on methodology and the other on the history of the Mountain West. In his spare time, George kept alive the institutional memory. I have since inferred that Ellsworth was perhaps as much archivist as he was historian, although in his case, the two professions were inseparable. George and Maria Ellsworth purchased a separate home a short distance from their 300 East Street family residence in Logan, the main floor of which George used as his study. It was here that I first became acquainted with George nearly a decade after his retirement and only a few short years before his death in 1997. My colleague Brad Cole had first worked with George to convince him to donate his extensive collection to the library. But after Brad left for a decade in Arizona, George invited me down to survey the contents of his life's work. George unlocked a side door to lead my colleague John Powell and me up the short span of stairs into the kitchen. The kitchen was used by one carefully screened graduate student. Otherwise, they occupied the basement floor. Beyond the kitchen, we entered the main parlor. I recognized immediately that this was much more than a simple study. This was a library, or more accurately, an archive. George actually kept his books in several rooms up at the family home. Around the walls were rows of map, microfilm, and filing cabinets, along with shelves containing an array of document boxes, all labeled, numbered, and impeccably well ordered. A vintage Kodograph microfilm reader stood in the corner, and in the center of the room, a large work table constructed of cinder blocks and plyboard. The configuration of the table left only enough space around the room's perimeter to open file drawers and allow for a walkway. The workplace looked chaotic. But if any of you have seen my place downstairs, I recognized immediately that the piles of papers and bundles of note cards represented what we archivists refer to as arrangement. We pretentiously say that it is the process of establishing physical and intellectual control over archives. But really, it's just making a mess and then cleaning it up. That's what it amounts to. I prefer the phrase, making order out of chaos. Although accomplished at archival arrangement and even more so at archival description, it became clear during the succeeding years of processing his collection that George was less proficient at another archival imperative known as deaccession. He never threw anything away. No document was indispensable, no scrap of information unessential. Both the weighty and the trivial, the eminent and ephemeral, all had significance in documenting the past. Who besides George Ellsworth would have kept 30 years of mimeographed invitations announcing the annual steak fry of the Faculty Men's Forum? The Faculty Men's Forum. It's now the Faculty Forum because it's no longer limited to only male members of the faculty. Any faculty members out there members of the Faculty Forum? I know there's one. Yeah, there's a couple of them back. There's a couple of, they don't have steak fries that much anymore, I understand. But anyway, if you want to look at those announcements, I've got them downstairs. I got 30 years worth that George kept. I've entitled this talk, A Few Things I've Learned About Working in the Archives. I don't know why I come up with that title, but it seems appropriate now that I've babbled on. There have been more than a few. The wonderful thing about my evolution within the library is that it's given me the opportunity to never stop learning. And I think that's one of the advantages of working at a university. I found out during graduate school that in addition to reading and writing history, I enjoyed getting my hands dirty with historical documents. And that's what I do. I process collections of materials. I select those documents that add to our knowledge of the university's development. But if I told you any more about what I do, how much I've enjoyed it, and what a great job it has been, then everyone may want to do it, and there are simply not enough dusty documents to go around. So from one Aggie to another, here's wishing the university a happy 125-year birthday. And I better just shut up. Thank you very much. You need to see that. There's always something in those boxes. Thank you. Am I?
Nice try, Bob. Before he gets out of it.
Jeez, I thought I was going to have to dance or something. Please. Thank you. Now, I'd be happy to entertain any questions you might have. Audrey?
What's the most unusual finding in the archives for you?
You know, I'd have to go back to a thing that I pulled out once when Patrick Williams come by to do a little thing in the that magazine that we have on campus. And I pulled out this brass medallion that had been found by groundskeepers who were working on the old Kane house down over the hill. And that was John T. Kane Jr.'s property, who was the first secretary-treasurer of the Board of Trustees, and essentially the founder of the university, because he did all the correspondence, hired Sanborn, it did everything. And one of the things that he did after the institution kind of got rolling in 1890 is he wrote to a place in Salt Lake, and I can't remember the name of the company now, but anyway, they made seals, you know, that you stamp, you put on envelopes, and he arranged for them to as a foundry and to manufacture a seal for the institution. And when he got it, and I'd never seen the thing, but there are letters in his letter book that he writes back, and he says, "This is just totally unacceptable. This thing, some figure on there looks like a cow, not a horse. The horse looks like a goat." And so the institution never used it. And I'd never seen it before, but anyway, these folks were down there digging in the flower beds, come up with this thing, and I have no idea how it got there, except that was Kane's property. And the Kane house now became the home of George Kane. And so that whole kind of area that's down below the hill down here, yeah, that's right, I'm right, was Kane property. And so my thinking is that he put it in his coat pocket, and he walking home one night, and he went, and so that's kind of I love that story. I mean, it's just how things kind of come back around, you know. You don't know. There's no representations. The seal was never used, but yet it shows up, and it is awful looking. I mean, it's really poor quality stuff. John Fleming.
Bob, what do you think of the future for archives now that the format of everything is so different, and there's the digital that notes are being made on, and there's not going to be something like George Ellsworth's collecting all his papers maybe.
It's a brave new world, John.
So you're out of a job.
Yeah, but I'm out of a job anyway before too long. You know, it's a whole different deal. We were talking, some colleagues of mine, and today we were talking about that very thing. You know, what are historians in the future going to base their research on? You know, there is no shortage of paper. There's still a lot of paper records being produced. But a lot of things that we used to take for granted that would be produced in paper are not being done in paper. And there's a lot of emails. There's a lot of correspondence that is carried on in different ways, non-traditional ways, you know. So it'll be different. To tell you the truth, nobody's figured that out yet. I haven't been trying very hard, and as soon as I really put my mind to it, I'll write to National Archives and tell them how to do it. Okay. Well, this is fun. Thank you. Thanks for coming.